Aunga, ngā awa, ngā moana, ngā rākau, ngā manu. He tiritiri mō tātou katoa o tātou wairoa te hangatanga te kotai. Kia mahi tari ai mō te ahau, tino pai rawa hui e, tai ki e. No mai, haere mai. Welcome along to our AEC Substack Live this Thursday evening or Thursday morning in the United Kingdom. Look, few topics in education generate as much discussion, passion, and probably disagreement as literacy. Over recent years, we've heard phrases such as the science of reading, structured literacy, balanced literacy, cognitive science, evidence-based practice, and teacher judgment. And these conversations have shaped policy, professional learning, classroom practice, and at times, the way we think about each other as educators. Yet literacy learning is profoundly a human endeavor. It involves language, cognition, culture, motivation, identity, relationships, and teaching. What we want to gain access to, we want to gain access to the rich world of literacy, and we want them to discover the power, joy, and meaning that it can bring. So tonight is an opportunity to move beyond the slogans and explore the complexity of literacy and literacy teaching. And we're fortunate to be joined by two amazing people who have contributed significantly to the conversation in recent years. Professor Dominic Wise is internationally recognised for his work in literacy, curriculum and education policy, and is the co-author of this amazing book, The Balancing Act. I'll just get that up so everyone can see it. And Dr. Rebecca Jesson is one of Aotearoa New Zealand's leading literacy researchers, whose work has focused over many years on improving literacy outcomes for all of our students. Welcome along. So the way tonight is going to go is Dominic's going to take over and have a bit of a presentation and talk about his work, his research. And then what we'll do at the end of that presentation, later on in the evening, Rebecca and Dominic will sort of join me for a bit of a discussion. And one of the things I'm particularly looking forward to is bringing together Dominic's international expertise and perspective, and then matching that back with Rebecca's deep understanding of what is going on in Aotearoa New Zealand. So we'll explore some opportunities. I've got a couple of provocations for the last 15, 20 minutes, but we'll also keep an eye on the chat and to see if questions surface. My hopefully we just leave this evening with a deeper understanding of the evidence, a greater appreciation for the complexity of literacy learning, and an increased confidence in our ability as educators to think critically about what's going on in our classrooms. Dominic, thank you so much for being here this early in the morning. Over to you.
Great, thank you very much. I'll just get the screen share on. Hopefully you can now see the first slide.
We're all good.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thanks so much for the invitation. You're absolutely right. This is a topic that rightly people care about, debate, discuss, argue, sometimes fall out over. And it's the work that I've been doing with my colleagues, particularly Charlotte Hacking and Alice Bradbury in the Helen Hamlin Centre for Pedagogy at UCL in London at the Institute of Education has certainly seemed to generate a lot of interest. And I've been, for the last, getting on now for 2 years, talking in all different parts of the world, quite, in some cases, a little unexpectedly. For example, doing a talk for more than 1,000 teachers in Shenzhen, China, was not particularly expected when we began work on this. I'm going to speak in Iceland in early September and so on. So there is something here that I'm not going to talk a great deal about because it's making me think even further about multilingual children, communities, families, and the way our double helix model of teaching reading and writing was built on that understanding that all classrooms are full of languages, accents, dialects, and that's the reality. That's the cold reality of how we have to help children, how we have to understand how to help children. So today, you can see here just the main areas that I want to focus on. I will say a bit about the debate because I think in other work we've done, we've looked at the way the debate plays out, the kinds of media attention and politics that are going on. And I don't think they are separable from questions about what's the most effective approach according to research, which I will also say something about. Whether we like it or not, there's a lot of politics, particularly in the debates about reading, often to the exclusion of other things, even sufficient attention to the teaching of writing, which, as I will argue, is deeply connected. I do want to say something about what some people call the science of reading. Wearing another hat, I've led education research from the perspective of education as an academic discipline in universities over several decades. And so I do know something about what research is, what it can tell us, what it can't tell us, what different methods of research tell us. And then I'll finish with just a very brief taster, if you like, of how some of these ideas are and might play out in practice. So let me begin then with some of the politics in England. Although, as you will hear, this is an international trend that England has quite a role in. And you can see here this quote from 2023. So we were approaching the end of the then Conservative government's time in power. The claim that English pupils are the best readers in the Western world. An international study had apparently found. That was published in the Daily Telegraph. And then the Prime Minister of the day, Rishi Sunak, was, for example, going around the country saying things like this: our kids here now are the best readers in the Western world. We changed how we teach our kids. We've focused on rigor and standards and giving parents more choice, and all of that has worked. And the league tables that Rishi Sunak was talking about, I will give you a little glimpse into that and to why we have to think in much more depth about the evidence from international comparative studies. So one of them is PISA. For PISA, 15-year-olds are tested periodically for their reading. And, frankly, even the most cursory glance at these headline figures, well, begs the question, of course, what did they mean by the Western world? That's a rather big characterization that needs some unpicking. But we've chosen here some countries where the English language is the medium of instruction in schools, is a dominant and legal language in society. And you can see, for example, Singapore in that chart is considerably above anyone else. Yes, New Zealand is present in a cluster of jurisdictions. Another high flyer, if you like, has been Canada, but they've also been recently through dramatic changes to how reading is taught. And so one can see that the basic claim that England is the best in the Western world can be challenged even on just these headline figures. And by the way, the detailed technical reports for studies such as PISA and Pearls do have a lot of incredibly valuable information. So it's not the studies per se. There's another debate about these studies and what they can and cannot tell us. But let's focus also, though, we have to take a rounded picture of all relevant data when we're going to consider how countries are doing. And now, looking at the Pearls data, it was in fact the Pearls data that was cherry-picked to defend the best in the West. But from that very same Pearls data, they usefully collect information about what pupils tell the researchers about how much they like reading. And it's plain to see there that in terms of how motivated children are in England at the time of the 2021 Pearls survey, they were not terrible. They certainly weren't the best in the West, and that's really concerning. And there are other. We now have national data sets showing a similar picture of a decline in motivation, and so this is important because if we all want children to read as well as possible, to write as well as possible, to learn as well as possible, and motivation is one really important part of learning. It's not the only part, but we have to take account of that. So if the system is working effectively, all of these statistics should be in the right direction. The other place to look for data at large scale in England, we've had statutory national assessments of all primary children in England, and actually for a long while we had similar kinds of assessments at secondary. But as we have these data, we do need to attend to them and see what is it telling us about how well, for example, policies are working. And England has had a very, in my view, certainly strong and I would say too narrow approach to the teaching of reading, at least since 2012. 2012 is a convenient mild point where our phonics screening check was first made statutory for all 6-year-old children. And the point that this I'm making in relation to this slide is that, the percentage of children not meeting the phonics screening check when they first take it at age 6 was 20%. But then just as important, if not more important, is how have they done by the end of their primary schooling? And you can see that what we call Key Stage 2, the kids take these statutory assessments when they're age 10 to 11. A quarter or more of children are not achieving the expected standard, in spite of an enormous drive with strong political power to have synthetic phonics, which it's a misnomer when it's called systematic synthetic phonics. It's synthetic phonics. We could have had other phonics approaches, but we don't. So that paints a picture of all is not rosy in England. Even more concerning, and this is work that we're doing more and more work now on children who have reading difficulties. We're really extending the work of the Balancing Acts Initiative to look even more carefully at these children. So you can see in these data that, first of all, there's the percentage of children who are not reading at the expected standard. That's a concern. But even more concerning are these children who are less than or scored less than or equal to the scale score of 80. So the scale score of 80 is the lowest possible score. And you can see that, roughly speaking, apart from 2023, for some reason, that looks like an anomaly. But roughly speaking, 4,500 to 5,000 children are really, really struggling badly every year in England. And those are the children that we know you can correlate from longitudinal studies that they are more likely to have very difficult life outcomes if they don't succeed in reading. And so that begs the question of why do we have this narrow synthetic phonics, and how have we ended up with it in England? I mean, if for those of you who know anything about the history of England and its national curriculum, prior to 1988, England didn't have a national curriculum at all, and teachers had huge power to determine what happened, what lessons they taught, and so on. Along came the first national curriculum, but the first national curriculum was what I would call a balanced perspective on what was called the subject of English. And ever since that time, I've tracked a trend of narrowing down and more emphasis on mainly on synthetic phonics. It's not to say the curriculum doesn't require teachers to teach other things, but the balance is in my view, inappropriately angled towards synthetic phonics. How does it? Well, so what are the levers? What are the political levers here, and what are the effects? So, a rough estimate, a crude estimate, we would say is that 15% of the whole curriculum, when children are roughly 6 to 7, is taken up by synthetic phonics, and in some cases it's an hour a day. It's a minimum, we think, of half an hour a day, often 3/4. So it's an enormous amount of time on one part of the reading curriculum. An important part, admittedly, but the whole point of our work is to say, hang on, we need to get these things properly in balance. Otherwise, we will not be helping children as well as we should be. The phonics screening check is perhaps the most powerful lever because teachers, not surprisingly, teach to the test because the stakes are high. Their schools are held to account, and teachers are held to account for the percentage of children that they get through this phonics screening check. As we know from other research, that distorts the curriculum. So that's very important. And then there are many other things that influence. I'm not going to influence how teachers deliver reading. I'm not going to talk particularly, for example, about the Her Majesty's Inspectorate, or what's called Ofsted, who are like a kind of, well, some have said they're like almost like an education police force, because they go around and insist, and they publish things that insist that synthetic phonics is the main thing that should be going on. This quote here is indicative. So we've also had, for some years, a panel has validated commercial phonics schemes. And so if they're validated, schools then are encouraged to select from the list of validated phonics schemes. And this was a note to guide the validation panel. Phonics teaching should not encourage children to guess unknown words from clues such as pictures or context, rather than first applying phonic knowledge and skills. The focus should be on phonemes and not on consonant clusters or onset and rhyme. And this, I think, this idea of guessing has become a trope. It's been lazily used by, frankly, some people who should know better. That, and then it's elided with the idea of a balanced approach. And a balanced approach has been ridiculed, and yet has a very strong and robust academic track record going back many years. And indeed, in any of the countries I've featured so far, the jurisdictions, you will find key texts that advocate have advocated for a balanced approach. So this idea that somehow a balanced approach just means saying to children, "Oh, just guess in any way," is a mischaracterization, a very unfair mischaracterization, and no basis in actual fact of what happens. So, and we need to think, when a child encounters a word that they struggle with, the idea that they should, for example, not use context is ridiculous, because the whole the essence of reading is to gain meaning. To do that, you have to link your approximations of written words with your oral vocabulary, and that is a test of context. That's not to say that I certainly agree that if a child is literally not trying to use the knowledge they have about the alphabetic code, that would also be inappropriate according to the evidence. But again, this whole talk is about balance. So a very quick now, whip round the world, as it were. I start with Ireland. Really, really interesting. In my view, I am slightly biased in the sense that I've been fortunate to be one of four international academic advisors to Ireland's development of its primary national curriculum since 2020. But but we only have a limited amount of influence. I mean, it's run by the civil servants, the government, and by stakeholders in Ireland. But I'd say go and look at their national curriculum. It's for primary. It's really quite unique. I think it's outstanding. For example, explicit attention to children's agency, teachers' agency. So I'm not just in that case, not only talking about their balanced approach to literacy. Australia, an enormous change of direction, and really explicitly, Nick Gibbon, ex-MP, who in England was one of the main architects of synthetic phonics, has been invited many times to Australia to advance his idea. He thinks it's all worked, and therefore Australia is following that. We're doing some work at the moment on how that's working out in different states. Canada, I've mentioned briefly before. I would argue, you could have argued on the previous policy that Canada really had a whole language approach. Now they've got this completely changed policies, dubious evidence base from the debate there. USA, perhaps the most extreme example, the extraordinary Solder Story podcasts that are by turn kind of impressive communications work, if you like, but wrong in so many respects. New Zealand, of course, you know a lot about that abandonment, it seems to me, of a previous whole language approach, the denigration, unreasonable denigration of the work of people like Marie Clay, mischaracterization, in fact, which we do address in the Balancing Act book. And then back to England. Well, we've just had a review of England's national curriculum that was established in 2014 that had all these extensive programs of study about synthetic phonics and about grammar teaching. Unfortunately, and some would say not surprisingly, no change to the teaching of reading and writing at all. And the early evidence is, because teams have been appointed now to write the new programs of study, early evidence is those programs of study will be even worse than what we have now. Okay, so a few problems, but I also want to focus on, well, what should we be doing and why? And for me, contextualized phonics teaching is one of the many important elements to a balanced approach. So I often, ask this question, and then I will show words, and they vary. Sometimes not in English, and there is the equivalent English to follow, but in French to read. And in French, we have a mainly consistent mapping of the letter I to the phoneme E, lire. Relatively, there are some small, it's not quite as transparent as, say, Spanish or Finnish. But so, and then here, of course, is the equivalent in English. And this time the question is, well, not really possible to answer. Because, of course, the word could be read or read, So obviously today I read a book, tomorrow I will read a book. And this is important because, of course, you cannot know the middle phoneme in that word. You cannot know it unless you have the full sentence context. It's just not possible. So if it was today I read a book, the middle phoneme is, of course, in the word read, is eh. And all of the things, this is what we have to try and get across to children if we're genuinely going to help them understand how the alphabetic code works in English. Tomorrow I'll read a book. Obviously, the middle phoneme is E. And so that's a small example, admittedly of one word, of how we contextualize phonics teaching, how we need to understand, how we need to share with children Yes, and in Spanish, for example, consistent letters to phonemes, but in English, inconsistent in many cases of the letters to phonemes, all due to the great vowel shift going back hundreds of years. And then this claim about synthetic phonics being first and foremost, and some would say furious. What does the research show us in relation to this very same question? The question is, should we contextualize our phonics teaching in sentences and texts and words? Now, I'm quoting here directly from a very good research study from the 1990s, Anne Cunningham, who did a randomized control trial to test whether it works better if you contextualize the phonics teaching than if you don't. And she found that it does work better. The children's outcomes in reading were statistically higher than if you did not contextualize. And she explained contextualization in the quote. So, for example, children may be told that when they came upon a word they did not know, they should think about the story they're reading and decide if the actor fits into their story of a baseball player. Thus, a more contextualized approach. This is 1990. This is high quality research that I've not seen cited in any policy document in anywhere. And this kind of research should be cited. Thus, a more contextualized approach was provided whereby the skill was taught and linked explicitly to earlier lessons and the activity of reading. And within that last bit of the sentence, you get this whole thing about purposes. Why are we trying to learn to read? What is reading? And that's just the citation there. I'll come back to the empirical studies a little glimpse. We cover them extensively in our books and papers. We cover the science of reading. Science of reading is not one person's view or one group of people. The science of reading is an enormous field, and involves the social sciences as well as things like neuroscience. Arguably could, of course, involve children, the study of children's literature, and many other things. But let me now move to some theories, because it turns out that theory has been really important in these debates. Some of you may be familiar with perhaps the most simple theory we have about reading, and of course it's called the simple view. Reading equals decoding times reading comprehension. Actually, it's comprehension. Now, some information then about the original and seminal paper that this simple view of reading was published in. First of all, it was based on studies of children with reading difficulties. And I am going to keep on saying today, we need to understand children with reading difficulties in some ways different from other children who find learning to read more straightforward. But this simple view is based on studies of children with reading difficulties. The question about the social context of the child is absent from this model. Like, we all know as teachers that you need to know enough about the community you're serving, the families you're serving, the individual child's experiences in relation to many things, but including in relation to books, texts, reading, interaction, not present in this model. Nor even the importance of text. So, just to give one example, we do have an ongoing debate about what another misnomer, quote, decodables or decodable text versus real books or real texts. But texts are absent from this model. So there's a kind of decontextualization of reading processes. Not unlike most models, writing is not part of the simple view of reading. And you may say, well, of course not, because it's a view of reading, not writing. But as you will see, we argue you actually do need to actively consider reading and writing together. Most of all, this influential and basically robust model it's a model of learning, not teaching. and yet it's used to defend things like synthetic phonics at all different levels. At policy level, policy documents cite the simple view of reading, and policy documents also interpret and misinterpret the simple view of reading. And so the authors themselves said quite clearly, we begin by noting the issue we wish to discuss is not that of the place of decoding in reading instruction. They were not talking about teaching. They were talking about learning. Now, they're not completely disconnected, obviously, but this matters. This matters if we're trying to think, well, what's going to work for the children I teach in my classroom? This is another influential theory, Hollis Scarborough's reading rope. I've kind of come across as a little more at school level, but it is also cited in some policy documents. You can see the basic division of language comprehension and word recognition is there. We have a little bit more detail around things like vocabulary, but one of the things that's curious is how do you get from the untangled strands of rope to the skill of reading, and all it says is increasingly strategic and increasingly automatic. That is what we only know a little bit about. However, the problem is that it suffers from some of the same limitations. It's a good model, it's robust, it's useful to some degree. But again, where's the social context of the child and text if we're thinking of a model of teaching? Where's writing? Once again, it's based on studies of children's reading difficulties, and once again, it's a model of learning, not teaching. So our work then has sought to redefine and reinterpret and offer new insights into what we think will be effective in terms of the teaching of reading, and we call this the Balancing Act Initiative. We've had, as well as the invitations to talk worldwide, we've had at different times, sometimes intensive attention through various forms of media, some of it positive, some of it less so. This was an interesting one where one of the main newspapers in the UK and indeed in worldwide, its editorial focused on, well, frankly, the view that English lessons at primary and secondary were just not creative enough. And England, actually, if you go back a long time to the 1970s, early 80s, England was known worldwide for its approach to creativity. That's certainly changed. The editorial cited a brilliant book by Carol Atherton called Reading Lessons, all about her beautifully woven narrative about her teaching secondary English and the texts and the power of text. And then our book, The Balancing Act, was also cited. Just to give this slide, just a little note about some of the papers that have formed, why we hold the views. These are our research papers. So the 2022 paper was influential, has been heavily cited. And then later, I worked with Charlotte Hacking, and we published our double helix of reading and writing, which I'll show you in a minute. And we also published the book, The Balancing Act, an evidence-based approach to teaching phonics, reading and writing. Most recently in last December, we published a paper on reading difficulties in Reading Research Quarterly. And the work continues. We've got an international comparative paper under review at the moment. So our alternative to models like the simple view of reading is the double helix of reading and writing. And this emerged through the process of writing the Balancing Act book. Charlotte and I, through our what we would call a close to practice relationship, Charlotte's outstanding expertise in teacher development, which she'd done over many years at the Centre for Literacy and Primary Education, plus her encyclopedic knowledge of children's literature and books for children, texts for children, and then my roots through teaching, but then much more research focused in my years last more than a decade, 20 years now. Okay, so what was key about this? Well, right at the top, for good reason, is the child and their languages. And comes back to what I said earlier. All classrooms are full of languages. Admittedly, in some typically city areas, and London being a classic case where we have hundreds of languages in the city and many, many languages spoken by children in most classrooms. And so the model begins there. It begins with, what do we know about the children that we're seeking to teach? What do we know about their languages? And of course, it does matter if a child is learning English from the perspective of having another language as their first language. All of this matters. Actually, the evidence shows in time they're likely to have an advantage because they make the links across languages. So we're beginning with the child, and it's important. This is an explicit part of how we understand any theory of teaching. We also consider the environment that their child is part of, and this links the top and the bottom of the model, but particularly the text. What kind of texts are they encountering? Are they in a home full of books, or are they in a home with relatively few books, and they're accessing texts in different ways, texts that are just in their environment. Digitally, obviously, the digital side is a key part of consideration of text these days. And you can see here, the statistics on speakers and languages just at large scale. Now, the question there is about, in nursery classes in England, so that'd be 3 to 4 year olds. In 2024, that statistic was 30%. So that's really a significant proportion of children who are multilingual, and we have to take account of that. We cannot have models that assume a kind of monolingual approach is the way to think about this. And then another key feature of the model is reading. If you teach reading well, you can help writing, and if you teach writing well, you help reading, and therefore we should be doing both. So the evidence on this is very strong. Steve Graham's work, for example, his systematic reviews and meta-analyses show both ways. There are multiple studies showing that teaching reading can improve writing and vice versa. So this is very well established. What we now need to do is work through, how do we do this in practice? How can we make this work? How can we improve both reading and writing through this systematic combination of teaching both? The model also is developmental in character. It acknowledges that children, are on a developmental continuum. As babies, of course, nearly all children will be aware of sounds. Gradually, that over years, that will become an awareness, a phonological awareness, especially if they're helped to focus on that appropriately. They're also engaging with objects as soon as they're born, and then gradually they experiment with making marks, and ultimately, with help, they will learn to actually hold things like, pencils, pens, paintbrushes, other mark-making tools, and ultimately will learn to write in the conventional sense. And this draws in the research. These are well-established traditions of research that sometimes are not being cited in debates and should be. The importance of phonological awareness developing through things like rhymes and nursery rhymes. There's a wealth of evidence of the active thinking that very young children do. They're pre-programmed to learn and to want to learn. And then right in the heart of the double helix of reading and writing, deliberately, the darker color, the middle, we have motivation and meaning. And so any approach, any effective approach, and we know from multiple studies again that if you focus explicitly on children's motivation for reading and writing, you get better outcomes. And indeed, the breaking the processes down, we're obviously comprehension of texts and composition of text that's what this whole thing is about, and we should not lose sight of that. That's why it's central. It's central to any teaching. It may not always be the main explicit focus of a lesson, but it's in the background at the very least. It's made reference to constantly. It contextualizes everything that we teach. Some more evidence. The famous study from 1984, the least motivated children in US middle grade to school might read on average 100,000 words per year, whereas children with average motivation might read 1 million words per year. So if we're familiar with the Matthew effect in reading, in other words, in more simple terms, the more you read, the better you get. You can see it's stark. If we don't motivate children, we are failing them. More generally, and of course, the double helix is imbued with a multidisciplinary perspective. And of course, when people talk about the science of reading, there are some out there, and Emily Hanford, the journalist, being one, who simply says, "Well, it's neuroscience or nothing." And even then, it's only one form of neuroscience that happens to fit the argument that she wants to make. So, you can look at neuroscience. So you look at the work of Usha Goswami, for example, a colleague I've worked with, for a different view of the teaching of reading and of how children's minds develop. We can also draw on linguistics. Seems to have been a bit quiet, really. We used to have a very healthy engagement with linguistics in education. I'm thinking of David Crystal, for example, and others. But this idea of language as a systemic resource for meaning, this is pure Halliday, Hallidayan linguistics. And absolutely right. That's how language works. And therefore, that's what should inform our teaching. I'm not going to go into another big strand of work from my career on grammar teaching. Again, in December, published a new paper. Actually, it was a really interesting approach that had some successes and some failures, and it helped us learn a great deal about the challenge of helping children learn conventional grammar. But overall, we argue that it's systematic playing with words and sentences in meaningful context is going to be more effective than what we have in England, I'm afraid, again, is an extensive set of grammatical terms to be learned. And in theory, how to use the grammar described by those terms. And yes, I always at some point in the presentation say, I am not saying that the phonics teaching is not important. I am not saying that learning the alphabetic code is not important. I've never said that. But what I am saying is the balance has to be better. You're going to get the best outcomes if the balance is right. And if we have this overemphasis on one part, then it obviously takes away from the other parts. Another little question I like to pose, a bit more difficult online, of course, but if we think about the English language, how many ways might there be to make the phoneme oo? How many different ways? And people sort of say, often actually people will say 5, 6, 7. I remember coming across this rather brilliant paper, linguistics paper, 38 different ways. So returning, if you like, to the idea of contextualization and the transparency or not of the English language. Some of you might say, well, I don't think children in my class are going to use Port Salut, the French cheese, very often. But these are all, of course, standard words in various English dictionaries. And so they are part of the language. And vowels are particularly tricky, but not only vowels. I mean, I'm doing a big project with the Welsh government at the moment, And we were just looking at them. There's a module, a teaching development module on the cracking the code, and we were talking about the sh phoneme. And I said, even with that, which is pretty regular, sh to make the sh phoneme, I live around near Cambridge, and there's a place called Chisholm with sh in the middle of that word, so it's with the split the phoneme. So even there, you never know. English as a whole, at the time, this linguist was looking at 40 speech sounds, 1,120 graphemes. Now, why does this matter? Why does this complexity matter? Well, for me, David Sher had this correct. We cannot, and it's not possible, to teach every single phoneme to grapheme relationship or phoneme to graphemes relationships. So what we have to do is give a really strong and accurate clue to children that you can learn certain things, and that will help you to decode words, but you've got to go beyond that. And I'm going to pose a question, not answer it now, but I think one of the real difficulties we face is, when should we stop the systematic phonics teaching, and for which children should we stop, and when? And when indeed should we stop because it's not working, which it doesn't for all children. Okay, so I said I'd return to some of the evidence. Now, you may criticize my approach a little here, because yes, I am prioritizing experimental trials, mainly randomized controlled trials. In another talk, I would have my qualitative researcher hat on and would be talking about that kind of research. But I think on questions of what is the most effective method, we do need to, everyone in the debate needs to seriously engage with this evidence. And if we seriously engage, we'll find that there is evidence that the balanced approach really does work, and that crude notions of, quotes, the science of reading are not good enough. So, and these are only examples. I mean, the paper we published in December, we've found more than 40 systematic reviews. Each one of those, of course, will have begun with thousands of hits and then whittled down to, say, 50 robust studies to address their questions. So there's an enormous amount of evidence out there. So I've just picked a few out. Carol Torgerson and colleagues in 2018 built on a previous review. And so theirs is a tertiary review. So they looked across lots of systematic reviews, and they said many studies have added phonics to whole language approaches. Now, whole language is almost now a dirty phrase in the debates. And these are, very good researchers saying the evidence shows that if you add phonics to whole language approach, what they called balanced instruction, that's most effective. It's more effective than if you do a crude narrow synthetic phonics. For struggling readers, work by Russell Gersten and colleagues noted that these are multiple components are needed. The successful interventions included a teaching of comprehension, passage reading fluency, and sometimes writing. And their view was that if writing was included, you got higher effect sizes. And then the Sebastian Suggett review, which I think is one we've paid quite a bit of attention to because it focused only on longitudinal studies, so studies that included tests of intervention children at least 11 months after the intervention is finished. In some cases, there are studies where 4 years later they were still testing the children to see if it was still effective. Suggett concluded that phonics interventions that included a comprehension component at key stage were more effective. So not phonics only, not first and foremost. Recent work then took this out of our paper on children with reading difficulties. So this idea of multi-component interventions, indeed, we're just doing a pilot trial of a new intervention based on the evidence from that paper. So ours is a multi-component intervention. Donegan and Wansek found more effective, not one, multiple. My colleague Miriam McBreen and ex-colleague Rob Savage found that multiple approaches to reading motivation or children's motivation were effective. And that if you address both motivation and skills-based components, you get better outcomes rather than only targeting reading skills. The evidence is plain. It's overwhelmingly strong that we need to have a balanced approach. And then I thought this systematic review by Roberts, Dumas, McNeish, and Cote was unusual in that they looked particularly at how much time should an intervention, for kids with reading difficulties, how long do they need? And they concluded that after 40 hours, if it wasn't working, you needed to change. You need to change, try something different. And in England, we have this, in the national curriculum, it says if children are not learning to read, just keep going with synthetic phonics for at least 3 years. Well, the evidence just doesn't support that. So on the one hand, we've got all these systematic reviews. Well, just to give you an example of one of the studies that was part of, the multiple studies that were reviewed, I've chosen this one that was done in England, 128 children. They were with reading difficulties. They were divided into 4 intervention groups. So you've got a group that received the teaching of reading with phonology. I'll explain what that meant in a minute. You've got a group that were just helped to do reading alone, one that did phonology alone, and then a control group, a business as usual control group. Now, interestingly, this package was modelled on the work of Marie Clay. Remember what I was saying, the unfair denigration of Marie Clay's work? Well, here we have a robust, randomised control trial that actually was informed by her work. It did include more attention to phonology, as they called it, and that, I suppose, although Clay did attend to phonology, it probably, we would say, should have had more attention. Anyway, the phonology conditions, so the kids who were in this group got all these things and more. You've obviously got looking at words. You're even looking at sentences. You're looking at the manipulation of syllables, how to identify and discriminate sounds or phonemes within words, and so on. So really, even the phonics teaching here it's not simple synthetic phonics. This is a proper systematic phonics approach. And what did the researchers find? This was Peter Hatcher, Charles Hume, and one other person, I think. They called this a phonological linkage hypothesis. So it's the joint approach that integrates the training of phonological skills with the teaching of reading. And I've highlighted this in red. Spending an equivalent amount of time concentrating on either component in isolation is less effective. And so in England, we have, and increasingly we have this in other jurisdictions, synthetic phonics is the main focus in lessons every day, largely to the exclusion of anything else. That is not an evidence-based position. Okay, so I can only give you a glimpse of what this might look like in practice. In the second half of the Balancing Act book, we go further, and we continue to do this work by talking to teachers and working with teachers to help us understand as well. Take a really good book for children, and as ever, I'm grateful to Charlotte Hacking for her knowledge. The wonderful Stanley Stick, for example. And, some of this is age-old good practice. We want to have a conversation. If the children encounter this book for the first time, and let's say we're beginning a week of, could be lessons with strong attention to phonics. It could be, a daily lesson. We can do this with a real book, but we want to do other things. So clearly we want to have a conversation, engage the children's imaginative ideas about what is the front cover telling us. And, now and again, we'll want to help children understand that these books are written by authors who are seeking to entertain, inform, in the best way they can. And that's what reading and writing is really like. And so on. Simple comprehension questions, or maybe not so simple. What might Stanley do with the stick, and so on. And as we work our way through the book, and we may on some occasions want to do a full reading and get the children's attention, get them wrapped in the story. And then other times we want to work through this and delve into some of the detail. This is one of the double page spreads, and the pictures, of course, tell a story with the text. And I remind you of the instruction not to let children guess words by looking at the pictures. Well, of course, you can't read these kind of texts unless you read the words and the pictures together. That's a deliberate author trick, if you like, more than a trick. It's the way the narrative is constructed. And so, yes, we can, if we want, we can focus on the alphabetic code with any appropriate text at any level. And so we might want to introduce the phonemes, and we'll obviously talk about the letter name S. And again, research is clear on this. We don't want to be pretending that letters don't have names, because that's not the way the system works. Letters have names and they represent phonemes in different ways. So sound and letter name, or phoneme and letter name, we want them to learn how to form letters. Yes, handwriting is important. Letter formation is important. It's one of the many things that are important. Yeah, we want them to learn this idea of blending and segmenting, but in the context of the whole text, that they understand the story, they understand what each sentence is doing, so they're therefore predisposed to attend to words and indeed letters and how they represent phonemes. So we can, if we wish, we can segment a word such as sun, and I'm sure I'm not enunciating each phoneme as clearly and correctly as I should be, but so the pronunciation side is a whole other realm of challenge, actually, especially with multilingual children and children with different dialects and accents, but perhaps for another day. We might want to introduce a different phoneme. Let's say and we mustn't forget that, of course, this is just wonderful authorship around the imagination that Stanley has and what he does with his stick, whether it's playing the oboe or the flute, whether it's befriending a monkey, retrieving a football. That's the motivation side. That's the excitement, isn't it? But yes, we have to understand the language and the words. And so, of course, we have words that all use the phoneme at and apple ankle, and so on. So we've got multiple opportunities. And I said that the model, the double helix, systematically brings together reading and writing. This is one little example of how a teacher did this. And the teacher just basically said to the children, what do you think is going on here? And just asked them to comment and scribe some of their comments. And these comments, of course, range from relatively straightforward literal points. He's got ginger hair, to inferential points. He's got a dad and a mum, or they're going to the beach because they've got a bucket, so inferring. And the one I quite like is right at the bottom there. He might be good. Okay, and so to finish off, and to emphasize the point, what is it that we mean by a balanced approach? Because a balanced approach has been ridiculed, continues to be ridiculed by some, continues to be, people say, and have said in print, oh, the balanced approach is just the whole language approach. Well, it's factually incorrect. So, yeah, I make the point there. And first and foremost, this is the balance between teaching based on the use of whole text and systematic teaching about the alphabetic code, but also the other features that are in the double helix. All need attention in appropriate ways. And so the balance that's struck is, for example, comprehending the meaning of written language, which is it should drive all the teaching. And that's carefully balanced with acquiring skills and knowledge. The question of knowledge is quite interesting in the sense of, well, is it knowledge? Are we acquiring knowledge? What is the knowledge that you absolutely need in order to read and write well? and given that these are actually mental processes, aren't they? And they're linked in complex ways to oral language. And then more directly, it's essential that lessons make explicit links between phonics teaching and other linguistic aspects using whole texts. And yes, we can see a place for reading scheme books with controlled vocabularies, but we think, again, the balance in some places is out of kilter. There's too much emphasis on what are called decodables. There are, of course, also commercial links going on there. And we need a rebalance towards the amazing teaching you can do and the enjoyment and motivation you can engender through using real books. So thanks very much. I'm happy to engage with any questions and comments. I will, there's a little bit of information there about our centre, and by all means, join us as an affiliate if you wish. And I will now stop sharing my screen.
Dominic, that was I could hear experienced, effective literacy teachers around the country screaming yes at their screens. You could just hear the people saying, "Yeah, this is what we have been doing." So I think to start off, just a little bit of a provocation is why are policymakers so attracted to certainty in a field that is categorized by complexity? So start off with you, Dominic, and then Rebecca, I'm just going to let you run because you've probably got a string of things you want to talk to Dominic about.
Yeah, I think there's something in the wider understanding of how politics works. I don't want to be too forgiving, but this idea of simple messages getting all the way from a policy table to the electorate, for example, inevitably you get simplification. Simplification in some ways is needed. There's also the thing that you've got to what extent is all the headline chatter what's it genuinely like in classrooms? And, I am prepared to admit that, oh, sorry, that's my phone going off. I'm, genuinely prepared to admit that on the ground and in classrooms, there's much more variety than the headline stuff. But that doesn't fully excuse it, because there are ways, of course, of simplifying the accurate messages. And it's not impossible, far from it. Many regions continue to successfully have policies that are around balanced literacy teaching. And they continue to convince electorates that that's the best way.
I'm interested, Dom, in the idea of the scripted program and the untrustworthy teacher. How do you respond to that?
Well, there's two bits there, isn't there? I mean, the untrustworthy teacher is very worrying because it's a denigration of professionals. And so that would take me to the level of, what should societies expect of professional people? In my view, professionals go through years of training in order to be autonomous to a large degree, as long as they're obviously, collaborating effectively and drawing on relevant evidence. The scripted side of things, yeah, I've seen horrific examples where it literally blow by blow, you have to follow the script. I think in the end, one of the massive problems there is you become unaware of what the children actually need. You're so busy trying to deliver the script that you're not able. You've no space, have you, to stop and ponder a particular child's response and reaction that's different from another child's. And of course, age-old problem. It's like the problem with printed materials more generally. They set the aims, and yet your aim good teaching is built on assessing your children, determining what the next steps are. Whereas the schemes and the scripted program just say these are the steps, irrespective of what you see with your own eyes and hear with your own ears.
It seems to be that, especially with that particular question that Rebecca posed, that that often successes are attributed to the program, yet things that go wrong are attributed to lacking fidelity to the program, therefore shifting the blame to the teacher. How does that play out with that autonomy?
Yeah, I think that's a real problem, isn't it? I mean, I think we can all agree that I think it's fair to say there are things that we know absolutely have to be done to help children learn to read and write. And therefore, a certain amount of fidelity to some key aspects is to give an obvious example. We know without doubt that children need systematic teaching about the alphabetic code. Not literally every child. There are some children who, I remember hearing this statistic. I was quite shocked because it came from a neuroscientist in the USA who said, 60% of children need systematic training to crack the alphabetic code. So immediately I thought, well, that means 40% don't. That's a lot of children. So now I've tried to track down the evidence for that statement, and there's no particular source that I could find. However, we know that most children need at least some systematic teaching to help them crack the alphabetic code. But that, so that, if you like, is fidelity to an idea. It's not, though, fidelity to what you've described as fidelity to a scripted program, for example. And here there is a rather interesting parallel with research. So one of the challenges, if I'm, leading a randomized controlled trial, we absolutely have to have a manual, and the teachers do need to show fidelity, because otherwise we don't know if it's the actual new intervention that's been the effect, or whether a whole host of other variables. But of course, that's research, and research has a specific purpose. It's, of course, one reason why we should also, and this is something I've done a lot of, look very carefully at what the researchers say the approach involved. Because that, if the approach has been successful, and if we want to replicate it in classrooms, we have to look very carefully and say, well, that bit would work in my classroom, but that bit wouldn't work, So, but overall, this idea of fidelity, or more generally, it's about politicians saying, this is the approach, you must do this approach. Well, I think there are a whole host of problems there. People are linking this to problems with teacher recruitment, teacher retention. It begs the question of, will people be attracted to a job as a teacher if they have no autonomy whatsoever and they're just treated like technicians? And coupled with that is the worrying trend we see of newly qualified teachers. They don't have the track record necessarily of different ways of doing things. And so they can become kind of de-skilled, I think, or at least the idea that they can think reflectively about what might work and make appropriate choices. It's certainly worrying. Yeah. Name of the neuroscientist. Yeah. Good question.
And Rebecca's onto it straight away.
It's in the book.
Fantastic.
It's in the book somewhere. The different view of reading. Oh, sorry. Usha Goswami, University of Cambridge. Yes, I do know that one. Yeah.
Have we got time for another question, Stephen?
Look, I got a text from someone. I said to someone, hey, are we going too long? And someone texted me back to say, this is the best engagement I've ever had with an academic ever. Carry on.
Thank you for that.
Dom, I've got a list of things, of single words, about things that are said to simplify the debate and create binaries. And one of them is the notion of haphazard. So you've said systematic a number of times. Can you talk more about what you mean when you say systematic?
Yeah, it's a great question, because we're wrestling with this in the work in Wales, actually. I mean, essentially for me, systematic means pre-planned by the teacher in collaboration with colleagues. It means series of lessons where the teacher has clear aims for what will be learned in the series of lessons. And, it's what we would regard as good teaching. I think it's the normal process of being a good teacher where you plan carefully. You get the necessary resources together, you deliver the teaching, you reflect on the teaching, you assess the children. That's for me what systematic means. I think it's become over exaggerated in, for example, you must teach the phonemes in this particular order, for example. Sat-pin for some reason has become a bit of a useful starting point. Whereas the evidence actually is there isn't evidence to say that you must teach phonemes in a particular order. Not surprising, really, because we still don't know quite how the child's brain cracks the code. So, I'm
What do you mean by that, Tom? We don't know exactly. I thought the science was settled
yeah.
and that everyone learns exactly the same way. I'm
I'm really
sorry,
sorry
that's
to
just
do
me
this.
being a bit facetious.
Would you excuse me for 1 minute? Because this has
No
gone
problem.
on. I can come back in 1 minute. Forgive me.
No worries. We'll be talking with Rebecca. This is classic.
So I can't ask Dom, but I see that Susan Sandretto was online, and she's brought up that notion of critical literacy. So, and when Dom comes back, we can put that to him. But it seems to me the notion of children actually thinking about what they're doing and thinking about their worldview and where they come from. That notion of thinking, you've just come in at the right time because I'm going to segue to you, Dom. Susan Sandretto's online and she's asking about critical literacy. And I widened it to thinking more generally. And I see it's a big part of your approach because presumably texts give you something to think about.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I think, well, first of all, our attention to a range of texts carefully selected for a range of reasons, for example, to represent different children's experiences, to challenge thinking, to do all the things that books can do. And of course, haven't said much about comprehension, but of course, what we really need to do is get beyond the decoding, focusing on decoding quite quickly so that we can then do much more work. In fact, it's a lifetime's work on how to comprehend texts, how to reflect on them. And of course, part of that crucially involves ultimately the ability to critique, damaging policy ideas in society or I don't know, racist views that we encounter in communities or whatever it is. All of that side is, of course, that's about being a literate person, isn't it? And I agree that's it's vital. I think the reason in a book there's only so much one can do. Who knows? If we do a second edition, then we can perhaps add certain aspects, such as more attention to the later. Not that I'm not. I mean, even very young children can be encouraged and supported to think carefully and think widely, can't they? And that's again, I think, the value of these incredible books that are written, especially for children, that I call real books, because they are cleverly playing with ideas that get into the children's minds, and then in time they can look down on those ideas and interrogate them.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah. Look, I think we could go on for hours, but I'm conscious of the fact that you have a day to get to, Dominic.
Yeah.
So, look, but any presentation for me that includes Port Salut cheese is an absolute winner in my books. But you've given us a lot to think about. We've heard the collective yeses coming from the screens. We've seen the comments, the love hearts that are going on. This is heartening, and it's also encouraging for our effective literacy teachers around the country who are, I would suggest, quite disillusioned with what's going on. And it gives us some hope. So, like Australia, we've had the benefit of having Nick Gibb visit us and speak at curriculum roadshows at incredible expense, of course, which is contentious. But what you have given us tonight is absolutely fantastic. So, on behalf of everyone involved, thank you for your time, the generosity in getting together this presentation for us. We are so lucky to have had you present with us.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you also to everyone who's taken the time to listen and engage. I really appreciate it, and good luck. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again.
For those of you that, thank you, Dominic.
Bye.
For those of you who have, for those of you who want a bit of background, we had Professor Yelena Aidarova in an AEC or in a webinar last year sometime talking about tracking the money behind the science of reading, and from an American perspective, that may be useful to go back and have a look at. Rebecca, thank you for your time. Really appreciate you taking the time just to give us some context. It was, it just gave me a bit of a warm feeling inside that, hey, hold on. Yeah, that feeling that you've had is not wrong.
Excellent. Thank you, Stephen.
So thank you so much. Let's wind it up there. And for those of you who are watching, if you're wanting to get online later this week and catch the dual act of Liam Rutherford and Claire Amos in their weekly catch-ups, make sure that you follow the AEC Substack and get on live for that. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely evening.
Ngā te wā.